Thank you.
Thank you. Get your microphone set up.
My microphone.
There we go.
Hello.
Hello. So, welcome to Sheffield. And you're actually, we were talking about this earlier, about you're kind of taking over Sheffield for the next couple of weeks in one form or another.
In a weird way, yes. There's going to be like a weekend-long conference at the university about Candyman next weekend.
It is, because it's the 30th anniversary.
That's right.
But we'll get into that in a bit. So just to give you a kind of idea of how we're going to play out tonight, we're going to spend, we're going to run the Q&A for about an hour or so. We'll then take a 15-minute interval. As part of that, we'll obviously come out to yourselves for questions and that side of things. And really, what I found fascinating about your career is just how diverse it is now. Some of the bold choices that you've made along the way. And I want to touch on some of those as we go along. But what I want to do is actually start right back at the beginning of your career. And there's a friend of mine who told me a story about how you got into music videos.
Yes.
So,
who was that?
I don't know if he's here yet, but if he is, I'll point you out if it's not true.
Yes.
But the story goes that you were in some college or polytechnic or something or other, and you're walking along, and back in the day when they used to have kind of payphones on the walls, and a payphone was ringing, and you picked it up, and there's somebody on the other end, and it was UB40 or a representative of UB40.
Well, actually, the story is true. I was at the National Film School in Beaconsfield, and it was August 1983, and it wasn't the era of payphones in the hallway, and the phone was ringing. I was trying to cut a film, and the phone kept ringing, and I didn't want to answer it. And eventually I went in the hallway and picked it up, and it was Brian Travers, who was the sax player from UB40. And he said, "Hello there, it's Brian Travers from UB40. Is there someone there that can make a video for us?" All right. So he said, "Well, come meet me at Birmingham New Street." So I did. I went. I got it. I didn't really know what was going on. It just sounded a bit crazy. So I went up. I went there, and he was waiting for me at the station, and I went to his. The UB40 had their own studio and everything in Birmingham. They had their own independent label, and they thought. I don't think they'd made a video for a song before, or at least not in a kind of big way. And they'd always done things on their own terms, and so Brian wanted to direct this video, and he thought, "I'll just hire some schmuck from film school because I don't know anything. It'll help me do it." And so that was his plan, basically. And I talked to him, and he was a great character. He was a lovely guy. He very sadly died last year. It was very tragic. But he was so full of energy and kind of crazy ideas and things. And so I just thought, well, I'm going to do this. This sounds like fun. And at the National Film School, we had the equipment. We had 16mm equipment and stuff that you needed, and we had vans too. So you could literally load the stuff up and drive up. So I got a bunch of people together and loaded up the van, and we drove up to Birmingham and we shot the video. And it went very well. It was kind of a lot of fun to do. And it was one of those odd things that I didn't think that much about it. And then literally a week after we finished the video, the record was like #1 all over the world. That was Red Red Wine.
Red Red Wine, yeah, absolutely.
It's just weird. Sometimes things happen like that. Not always. But I mean, I think it was weird for them. They weren't expecting it. Some things just, that record's never stopped being a hit since then. It's one of those things, And
speaking of hits, you actually followed it up with a couple of other big hitters as well.
Yeah.
If you don't know, he's been and directed the Frankie Goes to Hollywood video for Relax, and Bronski beat Small Town Boy.
That's right, yeah.
And Small Town Boy for me felt quite ahead of its time, because it was the first time you kind of there was a video with a narrative. There's almost like a story within the video.
Yeah.
And that was kind of like, music videos at the time didn't really feel like they had that.
Well, but that was also what I was trying to do with the Red Red Wine video as well. But definitely, the Bronski Beat one was it was a development of that, but also the song, as much as it was a disco song, it was almost like a kind of country and western song in that it had a narrative, and it was it wasn't just the song had a narrative, but Jimmy Somerville and the guys from Bronski Beat, they had a very clear story about what their background was. To me, the thing that I liked about music videos was that if a band was a band that people didn't really know, and that you could go and like make the song about what their cultural roots were, and that was usually what interested me. And obviously with Bronski Beat, they were politicized, and they were very much they had a very strong story about basically being, not just being, the Frankie thing was different, but the Bronski, because it was really about pleasure, and it was kind of about fun. But the Bronskis were about, about the idea that they were gay and they were oppressed because for no reason other than just their sexuality, which now seems pretty obvious. But in 1984, it was an unusual thing to put in a music video.
Oh, it was absolutely, and even how kind of out there the Relax video was as well, because obviously that had a degree of, I don't want to say controversy, but obviously at the time it did.
Well, yeah, it certainly did. I mean, in that it was banned, and the record was banned. So, but that was also a good lesson, because the controversy, Relax ended up being the biggest selling non-charity record of the 1980s. It was very, very profitable. So I think that the thing that happened that was interesting with Relax was not just that it was putting into the mainstream a gay culture and a kind of S&M culture, but it wasn't just a gay culture. It was also a kind, at the time in the early 80s, there was a gay culture that was hyper-masculine, and the sort of Leatherman, leather bar thing, which is in Cruising too, in the Pacino film. And that was something, but I think the way it was presented by the Frankies and in the Relax video, it wasn't threatening and scary like in Cruising. It was something that was kind of joyful and joyous. And these things obviously were all really before anything to do with AIDS was known or took place, and so it was kind of a brief kind of golden age where these things were coming into the mainstream and becoming popular in a mainstream way, but that they were actually, bringing out kind of those kinds of subcultures which prior to that point had been really taboo in a very serious way. It was, homophobia was a big deal in the early 80s. And I think what was great about Relax was that straight people liked Relax.
Yeah.
Straight people liked Relax.
It's still a great track.
Yeah. So I think it was very good that way. But, the Bronski thing was different because they had a very different... I remember talking to Jimmy Somerville, and he hated the Relax video. He thought it was trash, So they had to take a different approach. But that was also kind of fun. I think that was what was fun about the videos in that era, early days of MTV, is that the record companies didn't really have control over them. And so bands like UB40 or like Bronski Beat, that had a political message, or Frankie, that wanted to say something that was outside the mainstream, had the opportunity to. And then later that was all shut down. Honestly, it was shut down pretty quickly after that. Which is often a cycle, I think, in a new art form comes about and people have a brief period where they can do things. But certainly for me, by 1985, it was all over.
Yeah. And you can absolutely see that in the records that came out, probably, the post-punk era, the post... even the new romantic stuff, it had certainly gone a lot more commercial and mainstream, and those sorts of daring videos and songs probably they weren't about in the late 80s.
Well, yeah, after about 85, I couldn't get hired by a record company because I was regarded as dangerous. They thought I was going to take their money and give them something they couldn't show on Saturday morning swap shop. And that was the standard. I mean, that was the standard was, I didn't know this when I started. The standard was that was what they were at. MTV didn't start in the UK, I think, till 85.
Yeah.
So in America they had MTV from 1980, but didn't have it here. And so it was really kids shows on Saturday morning. They used to show these things, and they weren't going to show any of this stuff.
No, I always remember the show, the Depeche Mode video, Master and Servant on one of the kids' shows in the morning,
Yeah.
not realising that it was about S&M and bondage. But there we go, that was Saturday morning kids' TV in the 80s. So you were saying about how you couldn't get hired to do a music video. How did this kind of transition into, I guess, I know you did a bit of work for the BBC, but how did it transition into you getting Paper House lined up?
Well, yeah, I worked for the BBC for a couple of years, and I did 2 films there. You know, so they were, I mean, obviously because the Relax thing had made a lot of money, so people were interested. But, of course, what they were interested in was that, not something else. But I was interested in doing other things. So I did 2 films for the BBC in the mid-80s, which were a really good learning experience, I think. Neither of them are available anywhere now, but I have 16mm prints of them, so I will restore them one day. It's very, I remember when I made them and when I finished these films, I was in the cutting room at the BBC, and the editor said to me, the thing was finished, it was delivered, and there was the cans with the print of them, and he said, "You should take those." I said, "Why? I don't want to store that. What do I want that for?" And he said, "If you don't take it, it will disappear." The BBC are terrible at keeping anything. They throw everything away. And if they do keep it, they don't know where it is. Just too much stuff goes on there. So if you don't take it, I've got it. I've got the first generation materials of Body Contact and Smart Money, which were the 2 films I made at the BBC. I don't think they've hardly been seen since their transmission.
Well, there's a projector here as well, so next time you're in town.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think I need to digitally scan them rather than project them, because they're probably the only copies.
And I think around this time you actually did some even more diverse work, because I understand you worked for Jim Henson, you did a bit of work on Dark Crystal as well.
That was before. That was in 1980. But yeah, I was just working in the workshop on in the creature workshop.
And that was kind of something what I was going to ask you about in respect of Paper House and the idea of production design. Was that something that you kind of brought through from that experience of working with the kind of Jim Henson workshop? Did you always have that idea of production design in your head when you went into making feature films? Because it's something that's kind of carried through to a degree in a lot of your work.
Certainly, it was when Jim made Dark Crystal. What was interesting about it is that they had really large-scale sets, and everything. Nothing was. There was a few matte shots where things were painted in, but most of it was built full size, and all the sketches and the mystics, it was all up on a rostrum, so people could go underneath the set and operate the puppets from underneath. So it was like a whole little world, and it was done on a very big scale. It was pretty. That was in 1980 at Elstree Studios, and working with Jim was really a fabulous privilege to see what was going on there, because at the time when Jim was shooting Dark Crystal at Elstree, Kubrick was finishing The Shining, Spielberg was shooting Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Warren Beatty was shooting Reds. So all those people were around to just in some industrial park in Elstree, which is now a Tesco's car park, I think. And they were all sitting there eating the worst food you can imagine in the canteen. And it was, Spielberg, Kubrick. It's crazy to think about it. And those people are still the giants of the business in a way, but it was really the last gasp of that thing that happened in the 70s where the studios would give auteurs a real budget, and they were producing these films. Jim was the producer. He wasn't just directing this thing or writing it. He was in charge of it. It was his show, And the same with Lucas on Raiders of the Lost Ark. It was his show. It wasn't somebody breathing down his neck. Same with Warren Beatty and certainly with Kubrick. So these people were making these films on a huge scale with unlimited time, and they were experimenting with things. I remember that there was a whole B unit on The Shining that was working long after they'd finished shooting, and they had a little small stage which had a tank in it, and inside the tank they'd built a half-size replica of the lobby of the hotel, and once a week they used to go there with a giant vat of blood, and they would dump the blood behind the elevator, and the famous shot. They did this once a week for a year because it took them that long to clean it in between goes.
That seems a bit kind of held back for Kubrick, that really, just once a week for a year.
Well, it took a week to repaint the set. That's the point. But it's extraordinary. You can't imagine now it would just be farmed out to some digital compositors that you've never met, and they'd be somewhere, wherever they were, and they just send the frames back too late for you to change them.
Did you kind of grasp all this kind of magic that was going on at Elstree at the time, or did it just feel like a kind of another day at the office type of?
No, it felt, honestly, I was aware that it was magical at the time because these people were somewhat larger than life, and obviously quite a few of them are still around, Spielberg and Lucas and all that, but a lot of them are gone, is the truth, or not really working anymore.
What did you kind of take from that period then that you brought through into your films? Was it this idea of making something yours from a filming perspective?
I certainly wandered around the sound stages at the time and saw all the various different sets and saw what you could do within inside a studio. All those films were very studio bound. Dark Crystal, I don't think there was a shot anywhere outside the stage. And The Shining, there was some second unit helicopter work that was done in Colorado, but other than that, it was all done there, And it was interesting to see that, and to see, when you see these things that are there and you realize that the space that you see on screen in a movie is a kind of dreamlike artificial space. It's not a three-dimensional space that's around you. And that really came home to me, I think, when I was once in Portland, Oregon. And outside of Portland, Oregon is Mount Hood, and halfway up Mount Hood is the Overlook Hotel, the exterior that was in The Shining. And the hotel is a real place. It's called the Timberline Lodge. You can go there, and I remember going up there, and I was like, "Oh, I've really got to go inside." And I walked inside, and of course, the real Timberline Lodge is all wood and has a kind of pointed ceiling, and it's like a Western style Santa Fe wooden interior. It's certainly not Art Deco with huge picture windows like the ballroom and the interior of the set was. At Elstree, and you realize that there is no way in hell, in anybody's fantasy, that ballroom could exist inside that Timberline Lodge, which is a real building at the bottom on the glacier of Mount Hood up in Oregon. And but when you see the film, you don't question for a minute that they walk in one door and then they're in this deco ballroom. It's actual nonsense. And there's not one reference from the exterior to the interior. There's not any attempt at a reference even. And that was a really interesting lesson. You realize that the space that's on screen is whatever you want it to be. It's not real, that's for sure.
It's the magic of cinema. That's absolutely it.
Yeah, but I think people often don't realize that. And you know, you could take things too literally, and when films are literal, they don't have that kind of dream logic, which I think is what people really get, what appeals to people in a movie. One of the interesting things about a movie anyway is that, you know, why with all the technology and all this and all the rest of it, why are we still even interested in them? I think it's because there is something about the experience of watching a movie in a theatre that is a bit like a kind of waking dream, and that's an experience that people crave.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's part of the reason why I run this festival, to still kind of capture that experience with people. And I'll kind of go back to, I mentioned Paper House before, and the reason I wanted to bring it in is because when I was younger, that was one of the films that I guess brought me into the horror universe as well.
Yeah.
And it was kind of looking at your backstory and where you'd worked and re-watching Paper House, seeing the attention to how the house itself was designed and the rooms and that side of things, and talking about the dreamlike quality. That was kind of, I think, what probably fascinated me as a kid.
Yeah, well, to me, the film was almost just a demonstration of the idea that, you know, if you're shooting or watching a film and you say, this scene is real, this scene's a dream, this scene is real, this scene's a dream, but actually, within the context of the movie you're watching, they're all the same. There is literally no difference. So why do you label this reality and this a dream? And it's actually kind of an interesting concept that, as to why we view certain things that way. And I kind of thought that, so that's sort of what the film's about, really, that there's no difference.
Yeah. It's an avenue that's been explored, you know, various other films, but it was that thing of, yeah, you're going into your dream, and I guess it's not like Nightmare on Elm Street where all sorts of strange things can happen. It's a reality based in a dream. Well, I know it's Matthew Jacobs, who obviously you still work with today, who wrote the screenplay. Was it something he came to you with, or did you kind of...
No, it was something that I was developing, and I knew him from film school, actually. And I pitched the idea to Tim Bevan, who produced the film, and so we hired Matthew to write the screenplay. So it was a project that I had wanted to develop as a screenplay, and so yes, then Matthew came in and wrote it.
What sort of doors did Paper House open for you, kind of when it came out? Because I know for me as a youngster, it was a big thing between me and my friends. Was it kind of like Frankie Goes to Hollywood, big doors opening or shutting, or?
If only. No, I mean, yeah, people liked the film. Well, some people liked the film. Some people didn't like the film. That's always the way. I think if you make a film and everybody loves it, you've probably done something wrong. But yeah, some people, I don't know. I mean, people are weird when you show them a film, to be honest with you. You can't expect them to love it because most people don't. Most people don't love anything, really, do they? So certain people like the film. Certainly people in Hollywood, I think they saw that they could like maybe entice me to come and work in the salt mines, you know.
Never heard Hollywood described as a salt mine.
And I was willing to be enticed because it's, you know, when those people decide to get seductive, it's very easy to be seduced. So I went out there for sure, you know, but they got bored with me very quickly.
Is that so? How did because after that you went on and did Chicago Joe and the Showgirl?
Yeah, they got very bored after that.
Yeah, was that the salt mine outputs there, or was that?
Well, I remember having dinner with an agent at CAA at the time, and after Chicago Joe came out, he without embarrassment told me, yeah, well, let's say you were a 7, now you're a 3. I was like, wow, he killed himself, this guy. So what does that make him? It's a brutal business.
And I guess speaking of brutal, the next film that kind of came after that is Candyman.
It was, yes. Yeah, and it is true that, yeah.
Just because I'm a big Clive Barker fan as well, I'm curious to know about, I guess, partly how did that kind of come across your desk, but also did you feel kind of the weight of doing a Clive Barker adaptation?
No, not really. I mean, I knew Clive a little bit. When I was shooting, I think Chicago Joe, Clive was doing Nightbreed at Pinewood, and I bumped into him just again around the studio, and I think I had lunch with him a couple of times. He was just a very charming fellow, always was, Clive, and we just got talking, and there wasn't anything more than just socializing to it. But then at some point later, I was running out of money, and somebody, I think it was my then agents, had sent me a project that was an adaptation of another book, the story that was in the Book of Blood. I think it was In the Flesh, and it was a story set entirely in a prison cell at night in the dark. And I was like, well, this isn't going to work, because the one thing you can't depict on screen is darkness. Because if something's just dark, it doesn't look dark in a movie theatre, it looks grey. Because the screen is never completely black. And if it was completely black, all you can see is the exit signs. It doesn't actually work. So I said, yeah, this is, I like the story, but I don't see how you can make this film. But then there was the second, I think they sent me the book as well. And the story that was in it wasn't the actual Books of Blood, it was an anthology of those short stories. The second story was The Forbidden, and I think I just read it just to read it, and I thought, well, now this one you could film. So, you know, I knew Clive enough to call him up, and so I called him up and said, you know, I really like this story, what do you think? And he said, well, you can have it if you set it up. I want to be the executive producer. I said, all right, let's see what happens. So it was one of those funny things. Sometimes things are easy, and sometimes they're really, really hard. This one was really, really easy. I think the next day I went to see Steve Gull at Propaganda Films, and he said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I own this story by Clive Barker. And he went, oh, well, let's do that. So don't you want to hear what it's about? You know, it's like, but sometimes people just want something, you know.
And an iconic film kind of comes out of it, and obviously a horror icon follows as well. I know that obviously this year being the 30th anniversary, you're going to get asked a lot about Tony and Candyman.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to ask you about Virginia Madsen, because for me,
yes,
she is the kind of the heartbeat of that film. And there's some scenes which are absolutely tragic that happen to her in there. Tony, yes, is the icon, but Virginia Madsen kind of feels like she's the heart of that film.
Yeah, well, I think it's actually a very interesting thing that happens with horror films, in that one of the things that is a sort of weird psychological displacement that happens with them is that the villain, the horror monster, becomes the hero. You know, no one remembers anybody in Frankenstein except Boris Karloff. You know, but it's always been that way. There are all a million people that Freddy killed, and you can only remember Freddy. And I think that, you know, the notable exceptions are Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, and both those films have the same gag, which is that the villain, the monster, is inside the heroine, literally inside them, not figuratively inside them. And so I think that's why those two films are brilliant, is because they don't have to show you the monster, but they can show you the monster's effect on the heroine without cheating in any way. And it's why both those films are terrifying and also very moving in an odd way. I was always a very, very big fan of, particularly Rosemary's Baby, actually, which I think is, you know, a great template as a horror movie. This is not an endorsement of Roman Polanski. But you can't deny the brilliance of the film, you know, and Mia Farrow's performance, which is extraordinary in the film.
John Cassavetes and yeah, it is. And that whole thing about separating art from the artist is another one, but...
well, I mean, it predates, I think I think you have to separate things. When I think if you're going to study art forms, and you can't, yes, Polanski is clearly a felon and has been a fugitive from justice for years, and that's his legal position. But, you know, if you're going to study the horror film and you ignore him, you're going to miss a big piece of it, really. It's trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of, after Candyman, did you find, did it open those doors back into the salt mines for yourself, or did you find it just kind of gave you more opportunities to explore different work? Because after that, you kind of went on and did sorts of, again, bold choices and go down the period piece route and looking at Immortal Beloved and Anna Karenina.
Well, to me, those things are all, people think, oh, it's all so different, but to me it's all kind of the same in a weird way. In that it is true that after Candyman, I did experience real, you know, that moment in Hollywood where you can go in and they say, well, what do you want to do? And I used to say, well, I have this idea about Beethoven. And then they would say to me, what do you want to do that's not a film about Beethoven? So then I thought, okay, I better make this film now because they're never going to let me any other time. So yeah, to me they're very similar. To me, the whole thing of Immortal Beloved is kind of like a sort of dream-like collage about Beethoven, more than it's a factual kind of biography in that sense. In that, you know, if you're going to make, you know, and obviously a lot of that was inspired by Ken Russell, in particular The Music Lovers and Mahler. And the way the thing that I loved about what Ken did with all those music films was that he started with the music and he built the films around the music. So yes, they were always very factual, but he always had alienating devices in them. They were always kind of like ballets, you know, and they were kind of dreamlike and they were kind of excessive, but he was trying to make his point as if he was in an opera or if it was something. It didn't have to be, here's a strictly naturalistic portrayal of the composer. And I always thought that was just very exciting and very liberating. And you really, and he formed the movies around the music rather than the music was an afterthought. And as much as I really liked Amadeus, for example, to me Amadeus is a film where you could cut the music out and it wouldn't make any difference.
It's a biopic, isn't it, Amadeus?
Yeah, it's not even a biopic. I think it's a film about jealousy. And it's very powerful. The play certainly is very powerful in that way, and so is the film. But the musical sequences in the film are the weakest part of it, because it's sort of like they only work when Salieri talks all the way through the music. Nobody talks through the music in Ken Russell films.
Yeah.
You listen to the music. There's no one who's saying, Tchaikovsky did this while the 1812 Overture was playing. It's, Ken's got some crazy stuff going on with streamers and cannons. So to me, that was the approach that I was interested in, and it was great to be able to do that on that film.
Did you find kind of at this stage you're obviously hitting your stride filmically, and obviously you develop and getting that experience? Did you find that and now I want to make this next bold choice in something different? Did you feel like confident in being able to do it and pull it off?
Yeah, I thought I could pull it off, and it was actually a lot of fun to do. It was shot in Prague in '94. It was pretty shortly after the Velvet Revolution there. Václav Havel was the president. It was kind of an exciting place to be. It was like the Iron Curtain had fallen kind of thing. It was now Prague's just a tourist destination, but back then it was still a little bit on the edge.
And from there, you actually moved in and you started looking at, for the next few years, did some Tolstoy adaptations as well. So
yeah.
What was it about, I guess, Tolstoy in particular, but about, I guess, adapting classic literature that attracted you?
Well, it was really more to do with Tolstoy in particular. I hadn't really read any of it. But when I was researching Immortal Beloved, there was a Tolstoy novella called The Kreutzer Sonata, and I thought, I should read this to see what he has to say about Beethoven. And actually what he said about Beethoven was really fascinating, and I put it in the movie with Gary basically paraphrases parts of the Kreutzer Sonata in the film. And after that, I was intrigued and wanted to read more, so I did. And I think the thing that I found really appealing about Tolstoy was there's it's like a weird combination of almost total innocence and a total honesty, in that he'll write something down that he's thinking even if he knows it's wrong. And so there's a tremendous instant emotional appeal about the books that very few other writers in any language come close to, I think. And they're not difficult books to read at all. They're very accessible and very powerful. And he confronts all the sort of heavy stuff that the big existential questions. Tolstoy sits down and goes, I'm going to solve them now. He doesn't, not one, but he has a go. And I just thought there was something very universal and kind of interesting about the way the books function. Obviously, I started with trying to do Anna Karenina. I thought I'll start with the easy one. And it wasn't easy at all. It was kind of a little bit harder than I thought it was going to be. I think the problem is with a book that fat is that if you're going to turn it into a feature film of a normal length, you have to ditch so much of it. And you don't really know if the parts of it that you're ditching are the parts that make it work. You might think you know, but you don't really know. And it's very hard for it not to start feeling like a kind of highlights of the story. You know, Anna Karenina's 600-700 pages long. I think it's too long for a feature film to actually do it. And the problem is that the first half is the commercial story, where she's frustrated with her marriage and she falls in love with Vronsky and she leaves, and it's all very dramatic. The second half of the book is about how that doesn't change anything for her. And she's upheaved everything in her life, and she's still just as frustrated. That's actually the part of the book that's brilliant. And you know, that she doesn't die for love. She dies because she's depressed, because it didn't work out. Not that it didn't work out, but that's just the wrong thing to put your faith in, which is a kind of brilliant and very modern conclusion that Tolstoy comes to, but it's not the conclusion of any of the film versions. So I made a film that had that conclusion. The second half was all about that. And they didn't like it. They're like, I showed it at Warner Brothers when it was finished, and one of the executives turned around at the end and said, "My gosh, she's so unsympathetic. She cheats on her husband." To which there's no answer. I think that's the whole point, is that it's not whether somebody's sympathetic or not, it's just, you know, Tolstoy plays out what happens when you go down that road. And that's why the book is still powerful and still read, is that, you know, even though a lot of his ideas are just plain wrong, or stupid, some of them, or just crazy, but his ability to get inside people's heads and write down what they're thinking and doing while they're doing it is unparalleled. It's supernatural. And
that's something quite interesting that you talked about there, about going down a particular road, something that you did with Ivan's Ecstasy.
Yeah.
And it's that thing of, right, okay, here's something that perhaps you don't want to see happen, but you made a film basically about, you know, a man who's got this. Well, you actually show the death at the beginning, or you talk about the death, and then the film kind of.
Well, that's how the book is structured too. Yeah, you know, obviously, for me, the Anna Karenina film was a failure, and obviously it had difficult post-production, but it was a failure. But the difficult post-production was prompted by the fact that even in the longer version, it was still a failure. And it was a failure partly because, you know, the film was set in the 1880s, like the book, and so, you know, we'd gone to Russia and it had Maurizio Melonotti with all the costumes from Chiarelli's and all the jewellery, you know, Tsarist aristocrats in the 1880s. These people were very dressy, you know, and they were very rich. And so you've got all that stuff to look at, all that gold, and all those dresses and the jewellery and the hair, and I think in the end that's all you can see. And if you read the book, he doesn't describe any of that. He doesn't, because it's just the world that was around him. He doesn't spend any time describing the ballroom. He describes how the people feel at the ball. But if you're going to film it in its original setting, you end up having to photograph all that stuff, and it becomes distracting, I think. So I thought, well, this was a failure. Rather than saying I quit, I thought, well, how could it have worked? I thought, well, number one, the book was too long to make it to a reasonable length film, and number two, the setting was distracting. So I thought, why don't I try and do Ivan's Ecstasy in a really mundane, modern Los Angeles setting, just with the people and the setting that's around me. And then I kind of thought, well, maybe in the book he's a bureaucrat, low-ranking czarist bureaucrat. I thought, well, that's like an agent.
Yeah.
It's like a low-ranking bureaucrat, you know. So it just seemed like a kind of fun parallel, and I played with. And then, of course, the other thing was that nobody was the least bit interested in financing a film about somebody dying, because basically, if you want to get your film funded, there should be one of two things. It should be about people solving crimes, or about love conquering all. And if your film's not about those two things, they're not going to pay for it. And you can imagine that's not true, but I hate to tell you it's true. And yeah, I have a joke with friends of mine is that if you have whatever outrageous idea you have, like, oh, let's make a film about, you know, a milk bottle top manufacturer. Then if you say, who solves crimes, you could sell it to Netflix. So, you know, like, come up with a profession. Somebody, come up with a profession.
Taxi driver.
Well, that's too easy. Something a bit more weird, you know. What? A what?
A mortician.
A mortician who solves crimes. I mean, I think they've made that show. You know, but that's the point. Is that whatever the profession is, who solves crimes, you know, that's the thing. But if you're not solving crimes, and if you're not proving that love conquers all, they're going to look at you and go, we don't really know who the audience for this is.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm not saying that they're wrong either, really. I'm not trying to say that I'm right and they're wrong, because unfortunately they're right. But, you know, they can't be the only thing we leave behind us for this era.
Absolutely not.
And here's one thing here's one group of people that never solve crimes: policemen.
It's true. And again, I think that is what fascinates me about your career, in that you make those decisions that are different, and that kind of leads us into the film that we're screening here tonight, Travelling Light. So just kind of line us up with this, because I think, did you start filming this right when the pandemic was just kind of getting going?
Yeah, well, I think the thing that also happened with Ivan's Ecstasy, which was interesting, was that it was the very beginning of the digital era, and that suddenly there were these new cameras that Sony had made that would shoot HD. And at the time when I shot that film, which was in the summer of 1999, there were very few of the cameras around. They were really only beta testing them, and HD cams, and so I got a hold of one of these through somebody I knew at Sony, and we went out and shot it, and I thought, oh, obviously the cameras have changed a lot since then, but the basic principle that I saw from that camera has held up, which is that these things had unbelievable low light capabilities, number one, and number two, that you could produce a feature film looking quality without a crew, or with a very minimal crew, with a documentary-sized crew. You could if you wanted to. And, you know, since then people have come up with all sorts of wacky ways to actually double the size of crews. So I can't explain that. That's the nature of the business. But so by the time, you know, 20 years later, 2020, 21 years later actually, it was May 2020, and the whole pandemic thing had started, and it seemed to me, I was in Los Angeles, and I thought, well, this is a piece of whatever's going on here. This is a piece of history, just as much as anything. Just the way that all the streets are empty and no one's around or anything. And so I called a DP friend of mine. And I said, "What's the newest, best DSLR there is that nobody's using yet. And he said, it's the Lumix S1H. And the Lumix S1H, in case you're interested, shoots, it's not just that it shoots uncompressed 4K, but it has the same chip in it as the big Panasonic camera. So it really looks way better than most comparable DSLRs. It's also a lot more expensive. It's probably come down in price now. They're probably giving away with the cornflakes now. So, yeah, you spend all this money on these cameras, and 2 years later they're paperweights. This is the problem with digital movies. But so I got a hold of this camera. There was a camera store in New York, and they mailed it to me because all the shops were closed, and I knew that everybody wasn't working, and you know I've been working long enough to know a few actors around town. I knew they were all at home bored, so I thought, okay, and I knew various other people were trying to make things, but they were always, for some reason, they always ended up focusing on Zoom and saying things like, "Oh, I'll just direct it remotely." I thought, oh, fuck that. I'll come over to your house and shoot it, and it'll just be me. It won't be a crew. It will just be me, and I'll do the sound and I'll shoot the film and I'll shoot you in your own houses with the people you're living with. But I'm not shooting it through Zoom. This is boring. So I did that, and I had a vague plan. I wrote down in a book what I thought. I had this pen from this film I made in Japan, which was a Japanese pen. It was one of those pens where it looks like it's ink, but you can like erase it with the eraser head. And I wrote all in quite detail what I thought the structure of the film should be and the plot, and in a little black notebook. And I didn't show it to anybody. And about halfway through the film, I thought, oh, I should look at my notes to see how close what we're shooting is to what I wrote. But I put a coffee cup down on the notebook, and it had erased everything. There was just blank pages. And okay, well, I don't know what I wrote. So this film is an experiment, and I think often people don't talk about the difference between ad-libbing and improvising. Ad-libbing is, this scene, I'm coming in, I'm going to murder you. Now, just talk, make up the dialogue, or just ad-lib some dialogue. That's not really, improvising is where you don't know what I'm coming in the room to do. That's a different thing. And that was what we were doing here. It was pretty intense in that sense. And everybody was somewhat doing their own thing in a different way, although I knew they were all going to end up in the same place. And, for example, Tony Todd, who plays the lead, I was photographing him in downtown LA in Skid Row, and he's supposed to be driving an Uber around, and he starts talking to one of the passengers, and starts talking about how he's looking for his son who's disappeared. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And I found out later, Tony really was looking for his son. I mean, it wasn't a joke. I mean, he really was looking for his son, who really had disappeared. Wow. So that kind of became part of the movie, that Tony wanted to find his son. So I said, well, this is film. You're going around looking for your... We went out looking for him, and it was quite intense, really. And then the second thing that happened is that I thought it would be a fun thing for Tony to go through a car wash, and I'd film him in the car wash, and we go through the car wash, and the whole thing about the murder of George Floyd comes on the radio, and Tony's just listening to it, and so we, in a sense, the film has this sort of, we genuinely were reacting in real time to these things that were happening. But the trick was to try and shoot them like it was a film that had been storyboarded, which is a weird trick. That was the experiment. And without wishing to give the end of the film away, literally, climaxed into like the unrest that happened in the city at the end of May, which of course I certainly had no way of knowing where that was going.
And that's what fascinates me about the film, in that you were filming during the pandemic. It was almost like a snapshot of what was going on at the time, and you were reflecting what was going on at the time, almost like a documentary. Whereas all these other films that have been shot at the same time were hiding the fact that there's a pandemic going on, and just making it as though it was, this could have been shot any time, but actually, in whatever Mission Impossible, everyone was wearing masks and keeping 2 foot apart or 2 meters apart.
That's right. On all those movies, the crew are in masks and the actors aren't. On my film, the actors are in masks and I'm not. Because my glasses steam up if I wear a mask. It just doesn't work for me. But the thing was, as well, that was interesting about it is that because I didn't know where it was going, when I started the film, I said to everybody, look, somebody could get sick on this picture and die. And I want you to all sign disclaimers saying it's not my fault. And, because people didn't really know what was going on at the time, And the truth is, in May 2020, there was basically no coronavirus in LA. There's much more coronavirus than now today. People they just, at a certain point, okay, that's just what's going on. And so the film became more about George Floyd, and it also became about the things that people were doing to cope. And the things that they were doing were things that were real, like having parties. And we all know now what really was going on while they were lecturing us, that they were having parties. But it's not that I knew that, it's just that's what was going on. People go, come over to my house, just won't tell anybody. And so these people would, and this whole thing of lockdown, it became very clear to me, was a kind of bourgeois fantasy, in as much as the people who were being locked down had big houses and gardens and were ordering food from people who were crammed into kitchens. Those are the people who got sick.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was the same here,
Absolutely, yeah. Unfortunately, it was, and again, that's why it's so fascinating to me. It's a snapshot of life that hasn't been captured anywhere else.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to, I don't have an agenda. I'm not on this side or that side. There were no vaccines at the time I made the film, obviously. There was no anything, really. And I just thought this is such a crazy, intense moment. And of a really a psychic disturbance. I think people did go insane. I think a lot of people are still really suffering from it too, in a way that they haven't fully owned up to. I think everybody, literally everybody, has a form of PTSD from the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Don't you think? It feels that way to me.
Yeah. 100%. Now, unfortunately, we're very much bumping up against time, and I did want to kind of open it up to some questions before we kind of take a short break of the film. So, has anybody got any questions in the audience that they want to ask Bernard at all?
Hi there. I was just wondering if you were starting again now as a filmmaker coming up, would you look to take a similar kind of route as to what you had and try and go to film school and hang around, with people working in the industry that are well established and do much the same kind of thing, or do you look at the landscape now and think it's so different now? I think if I was starting out, I would do something completely different and I would carve a path this way. How would you improve or just do differently your career?
Well, it's impossible to say because, yes, it's very different now. The problem in 1980 was access to equipment, and the equipment that was professional standard was very, very, very expensive and outside of the realm of something that anyone could reasonably afford themselves, which is certainly not true now. You know, if you want to make a film, I think the means are pretty much within most people's scope. You could borrow or obtain decent enough equipment to do it. The problem now is absolutely one of distribution and exhibition, in that it's really, 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 I think it's harder now to get your work seen than it was then, because there was a lot less then of stuff that was made. So if you made something, somebody was going to show it just out of curiosity. Whereas now, that's not true. And now it's really, really hard to get anything that's outside or different or self-produced. Even for me, frankly, it's hard to get it shown anywhere, because there's a kind of nervousness in the curation through the kind of legit channels. If you look at a thing like, I don't know, something like the Toronto Film Festival, it's a good example. It's a big mainstream American film festival. In the late 80s, when I think Paper House premiered there. So first time I went to Toronto was, say, 89. And in 89, if you went to Toronto, you'd see all kinds of interesting, weird, small films. Now, if you go to Toronto, it's all studio releases. You know, and I think it's like the London Film Festival and places like that. Now, you don't see anything that's not produced in the system. That if there isn't one of the institutions involved in it, or it's an international co-production, or it's a studio movie, they kind of don't want it. And so I think, weirdly, the obsession with the well-made film has become worse because it's become so easy for people to make films. You know, it's easy to make a film, and it's really, really, really hard to earn a living doing it now, unless you're just basically hired to do what they want, you know? And I think that's the dilemma for a filmmaker starting out today, is not how do you make your film, but how do you break through that? I don't have the answer. I wish I knew what to say about that.
Nice.
Yes, go on.
Hi, yeah, ask a question about Candyman. What was the thinking behind setting the film in Cabrini Green rather than in a city of Liverpool? I think, like it was originally in the Barker novel. It was a really interesting decision, and it was good to get your thoughts on that.
It was partly motivated by the fact that Clive had a lot of problems with Hellraiser, in that they'd ended up having to dub all the actors into a kind of weird Midwestern kind of featureless setting, even though the film is, you know, clearly shot in the UK. And I think there was, especially in the genre, there was a huge resistance to that kind of specific setting in the UK. And so, you know, at the time I said to Clive, well, let's just do it in America. And he was totally into that idea. And then I went to Chicago just looking for somewhere to set it, and that was when I found Cabrini Green, and that whole thing fell into place.
I think we'll just do one more very quick. One over here. Right. What I'm going to do is ask you on the end to come down here to get the microphone, or you can back.
So obviously I've not seen the film, so I don't know what you're depicting with the Black Lives Matter protests, but saying about how you filmed what was actually going on, and obviously some of the stuff coming out there, we're seeing even like news reporters getting beaten up by police, and you know, and all of that. So I guess it's a question of like, how did you manage to get the footage that you did, and were you caught up in, you know, all of the chaos, particularly from the police?
You will have to see the movie.
Okay. Fair enough.
Is that it then? You're just going to have to...
Yeah.
It's actually, that's quite a nice line to leave it on. I do appreciate we're slightly run behind time, so we're 8:05 now. So if we kind of look for a 10-minute interval and then we can screen the film. But it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you, and it's
Thank you for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, and I could chat to you for hours about pretty much everything because you're such good company. But if you wouldn't mind just joining me in thanking Bernard for coming tonight. I'm sure we might be about to buy me a drink if you wanted to as well in a bit.
Yes, drinks welcome, yes.
Thank you very much, everyone.